Welcome, everyone, to another Wednesday evening Clear Mountain live stream. Today, we're joined by Bhante Jinasiri from Sri Lanka. And Bhante is someone I actually just recently learned more about. A few weeks ago, we learned that we could actually get an interview with him. Rather than kind of butcher your biography, Bhante, I actually hope that you might introduce yourself with a bit of your history and just thank you for joining us and taking the time today, really.
I was formerly known as Bhante Jason because I used to wander around Australia between 2011 and 2019. I walked probably anywhere between 5 and 7,000 kilometers through the eastern coastal region of Australia. That was after I ordained in Sri Lanka in 2010. People often ask me why I chose to wander through a non-Buddhist country like that. The reason was essentially that I consider myself to be a very sincere monk who's loyal to the teachings of the historical Buddha. And it struck me as quite outstanding how the historical Buddha and his early disciples chose to wander for their entire life. The most famous example is actually the Buddha himself, who literally wandered onto his deathbed. So after I ordained, I thought to myself, I've spent quite a bit of time trying to find somebody who can do this, but I didn't find that person. So I better just train myself as well as I can by looking at the texts and experimenting and doing my very, very best to just try to work it out without making any assumptions. Big test. If it doesn't work out, then I'm just going to have to admit to everybody there's a lot of egg on my face and it hasn't worked out. But at least we know that it really doesn't work out. But fortunately, we found that after now 13 years of wandering around in many different places, many different circumstances, that the early Buddhist model of monasticism actually does work really, really well. So after now about 13, 14 years of living very, very quietly as a wandering monk, I've decided to head back into the real world, which includes the internet, and share a few of those stories.
Thank you, Bhante. And how many years total were you wandering in Australia, and how many have you been moving through Sri Lanka for?
Yeah, right. So started wandering in Australia in 2011 and stopped in 2019, and then arrived in Sri Lanka in 2019. I've been pretty much exclusively in Sri Lanka since then.
And what was your experience contrasting those two places of wandering? What's the difference been, in wandering a non-Buddhist country versus wandering through Sri Lanka these last few years for you?
Yep. So the biggest difference is that in Sri Lanka, when you walk down the street as a wandering monk, people recognize what you do and they chase you down the street to give you food. So you never have to worry about your survival in Sri Lanka. There's always a place to stay because there's a temple every 5 kilometers at the very least. If you're in urban areas, well-populated areas, there'll be a temple every 1 kilometer. But in Australia, if you go wandering in places where you don't know anyone, there is a big question mark about whether or not you're going to survive to the next week. But fortunately, I found that I survived for 8 years in Australia doing that. You've got to be smart. You can't just naively wander around in any place in the middle of the night, pubs and brothels. But if you do it smart, you can definitely get by. But it's probably something you could only do in Australia as a young person. It's pretty arduous.
Can you tell us a bit about that experience in Australia? Like, what would your daily, maybe you could share 2 or 3 experiences which especially moved you in terms of the generosity shown, or kind of what your daily life would look like living just on the road, basically, or in the forest.
Yeah, so when I first arrived back in Australia, I flew deliberately to a place where I had no friends and no family, so that I could test very, very thoroughly whether or not it was just possible to wander around, living in accordance with the rules of the monk's life, and somehow that would attract the assistance that you need to make it through. I arrived on Gold Coast Airport, This is near the southern border of Queensland on the eastern coast of Australia. And then I decided to walk northwards about 1,500 kilometers towards a town called Townsville. Upon the recommendation of a senior monk many, many years ago, that an island next to Townsville called Magnetic Island would be a great place to spend a ranger retreat. So I didn't have a map. I didn't have a mobile phone, no money, no friends, no supporters, no shoes. I just had 3 robes, a bowl, and a small bag. And I just thought, well, Australia's pretty easy on the east coast. All you need to do is walk towards the water and then turn left. And then you just keep walking one step at a time for 1,500 kilometers with the water on the right-hand side, then eventually you're going to hit Townsville. I arrive at about 10 o'clock in the morning. It's a rainy day, but not too cold. So the reason why I flew to the Gold Coast, because I figured that if I were to arrive anywhere further south in the Gold Coast, then I could freeze to death at nighttime if I was sleeping outside with just my robes. It was cold, drizzly, but not too cold. 10 o'clock, I've got 2 hours to collect food. I didn't know how I was going to do it. I just thought, well, I'll wander out with my bowl and we'll check out the reaction and we'll play it from there. I wander out onto the streets, into a suburb. In Australia, as I'm sure in the States as well, nobody's around in the daytime. If people don't work, if there's people inside their homes, they're locked up inside their homes, they're probably watching television or on the internet. Front gates closed, walls are pretty high. Mostly people aren't going to see you. But I tried anyway. I thought, okay, well, let's see what the gods can do for us. Wander around until about 11 o'clock on suburban streets, nothing. Nobody sees me, no food's coming my way. So I think, okay, clearly this is not going to work. It looks like I'm not going to eat today. But let's just walk at least in a public place, maybe just down the highway, northward towards Townsville and see what happens. Gets towards about 11:30, and I'm thinking, okay, this is not going to work as well. So I'm just going to have to go hungry today. About 11:45, I happen to walk past a large shopping center. And I'm not thinking very much about it, whether or not I'm going to get some food there. And then a car stops next to me. And then a young lady comes out with a camera and says, oh gosh, can I take a photo of you? And I said, yeah, I guess so. And she takes a photo and she says, you know what? It's really cool that you're a Buddhist monk because the Dalai Lama, one of the Dalai Lama's books saved my life. And I said, oh, really? How to do that? And she said, well, I realize I'm not the center of the universe. I said, oh, well, that's a good thing. It's a good thing to work. And she said, you know, what can I do for you? And I said, well, I'm a wandering monk trying to live the old lifestyle. And right now I'm collecting food for my day. And she said, oh, no problem. I'll go into the supermarket and grab some food for you. What do you want? And I said, well, just get me whatever you want to give to me. She buys some fruit and some bread, throws into my bowl, and that's my food for the day. That sort of thing happened over and over and over again for 1,500 kilometers all the way to Townsville and all the way back down to the Gold Coast again, and all the way between the Gold Coast and Sydney, another 1,000 kilometers.
What does that do to your perception of people in society over the course of 10 or 11 years of relying on that sort of spontaneous generosity? And can you get us another story? Because that was great.
Yeah, absolutely. So what it does is it makes you realize that people aren't all that bad. We don't want to be naive. People aren't all that good either. But the theory behind the wandering life is that if you make yourself vulnerable in a wise way and noble way, then you're going to attract something similar to you. And you probably can't do it everywhere. You can't be wandering at nighttime around pubs and brothels. But if you're around the daytime, you're dressed nobly, you face difficult situations with peace and calm, then people really appreciate that. It's something that they're looking for inside their lives, and it draws out the goodness that's inside of them. So the Buddha taught that it's really difficult to be reborn as a human being. You have to have done many, many good things over quite a lot of lifetimes in order to get out of the animal realm into the human realm, let alone to stay inside the human realm. So there's seeds, not just a single seed, but many seeds and many roots of goodness inside of everybody. It's just a question of how you can draw it out of people. And unfortunately, today we just get the wrong messages about exactly how we can interact with others so that we can bring out the goodness. We bring out the greed, hatred, and delusion essentially through profit making and through overprotection of ourselves.
And do you have a example of kind of drawing out that goodness, or maybe a challenging moment you did face, one of these difficult circumstances where you had to rely on that equanimity and Brahmaviharas?
Yeah, so I remember the one time after I arrived in Townsville where I've collected my food and I've gone to a park and I've eaten it and I'm just wandering back to the place where I'm staying. And from a distance, a man starts to openly abuse me. So I'm maybe about 200 meters away and he's calling from his balcony, abusing me with all sorts of rude words, insulting me with all sorts of different peculiar perspectives. And he doesn't stop. He just keeps on going as I'm walking towards him. And he keeps on going as I'm walking away as well. Now, by that time on my journeys, I'd already walked from the Gold Coast to Townsville, about 1,500 kilometers. I'd given myself a rule that I'd follow the rule inside the suttas that if somebody abused you 3 times, then you need to do something about it. And I figured, okay, this is the first time he's doing it. If he's there again tomorrow and there again the day after that, then on the 4th occasion, I'll actually turn around and ask him, okay, what's going on here, mate? Please tell me, and let's work out some sort of agreement so this doesn't happen again. So that's the first time. Now, when a person abuses you, as we all know, it's really, really painful. And what I've discovered is that the reason for doing ascetic practices is not to be tough, but is actually to learn how to love. The underlying tendencies the Buddha taught is that when you're experiencing pleasure, then you give rise to greed and lust. And when you're experiencing pain, you give rise to anger, hatred, and fear. And the purpose of the Brahmaviharas, the Buddhist practice of love, is a cure to anger, hatred, and fear. So the most important times to be able to love is when you're in pain. It's easy to love in good times. It's easy to love when people are beautiful and giving you compliments and chocolates. But the real test of how big your love is with whether or not you can forgive people when they're giving you lots and lots of pain. The Buddha even goes so far as to say you need to learn not to get angry at people even when they're sawing off your limbs with a 2-handled saw, just to make sure we don't misunderstand the message. So he's abusing me over and over and over again, continuously for several minutes. And I've given myself the task of getting through that without answering back and getting through with nobility. Now, I'm not an arhat, right? So, you know, it's actually bugging me. It's actually making me angry, and it's hurting a lot. But I've got to learn how to control myself, and I've got to see the fact that I'm angry, and I've got to see the fact that the reason why I'm angry is because I'm in pain. And inside of that situation, I've got to learn how to love this guy. And so how do you do it? Well, step number 1 is you got to notice that you're in pain, and you got to notice that it's making you angry. And you got to be okay with that. You got to be okay with the fact that you're not perfect. And then you have to stop yourself from getting out of control angry, and accept at the same time that there's no way you could stop yourself completely from being angry because you're not fully enlightened. But at least I've got some self-control. And as an ascetic, I'm used to pain. I've given myself the exercise. I've given myself a lifestyle where I deliberately expose myself to pain so that I can get really good at dealing with it in skillful ways instead of getting angry and scared. or just angry and scared, just a little bit angry and scared. And at the same time, I keep my mind in right view. I tell myself, right, okay, this man is not my enemy. This man is not inherently somebody that I need to be angry about and somebody that I need to attack. This man is a man who's beset by ignorance and benighted. And he's going to suffer in the future for this. And if I get angry, or any more angry than I automatically am, then I'm going to suffer even more. But if I make the effort to control myself and make the effort to really establish myself in right view and right motivation, then I make incredibly good karma for myself. So the long-term benefits of me going through this pain right now really make the exercise worth it. So even though there's not so much pleasure to be had right inside this situation, I can delay gratification and thus make the control myself so that I can get a good long-term outcome. So get through that without turning around, without insulting him, without raising my hands, getting into a fight, thinking, okay, I can take this another 2 times. But after that, I've got to have some sort of strategy by which I can face him and then bring the situation down peacefully. But in the meantime, let's see what happens if I just walk away. So I walk away and I never see him ever again, and the problem's solved.
Thank you for that. And, you know, when you speak about this path as one of the original models the Buddha set up and how rare it is to see it pursued with sort of such continuity, I think one of the few monks I know of, although I know of a few who've pursued it with some degree of continuity similar to your own, but the one I think we all know is Venerable Jnanadipa in Sri Lanka. I believe he was Dutch.
He was Danish.
Danish,
He was
Danish.
And actually French by birth.
And I believe he wandered in Sri Lanka for most of his life, and you were present for the final months of his life when he was finally in one place giving his sort of the final teachings of his life from all of his wanderings. So I wondered if you could tell us a bit about him and about your time with him, the fruits you saw of this life of wandering and developing these qualities.
Yeah. Nandita Bhante was a really incredible guy. I heard about him when I was wandering in Australia. The people who were in the know about Buddhism in Sri Lanka would often bring up his name once they met him because we were doing similar things. When I arrived back in Sri Lanka in 2019, I had in the back of my mind that I wanted to meet him, but I didn't know where he was. He was a very difficult man to find. And during my very first charaka in Sri Lanka in 2020, I happened to meet a group of monks who considered themselves to be, in a sense, his students. So they were actually students of a well-known writer in Sri Lanka called Jnana Vira. But Jnanadipa Bhante was one of Jnana Vira's students as well, although he'd never met him, but considered a student of his writings. And so this group of monks happened to know where Jnanadipa Bhante was. After I met them, they were residing near Kandy. I decided to cancel the trip up to the northern side of Sri Lanka that I was going on, and then go to the southern side of Sri Lanka to meet Jnanadipa Bhante instead. This was as COVID was starting to heat up. And when I got to the monastery called Tanjang Tanda, where Jnanadipa was residing and actually dying of cancer, we got locked down. This was March of 2020. And we spent several months with Jnanadipa Bhante receiving his very last teachings. He actually didn't spend very much time teaching at all during his lifetime, but just before he died, he decided he'd better impart onto those who were interested what Dhamma he could. And the story of those teachings overall can be read about in Bhante Joe's book, The Ending of Body and Mind, that can be found on the internet.
I'll link to it in the description as well, yes.
So now Jnanadipa Bhante, he lived a life of really deep solitude inside the forest and was renowned throughout Sri Lanka for his commitment to that ascetic lifestyle. It was to such an extent that he would live inside the forest without a mosquito net. And you would think that, well, he must have been inside of his kuti, and his kuti was very well sealed. Well, no, he actually had this practice of building kutis that had a maximum of 3 walls, and had a movement in a place called in Sri Lanka called Lagala, where the rule is, okay, we've got kutis, and all of the kutis have a maximum of 3 walls. So if you want to live with non-Bhikkhu Bhante, then you've got to learn to deal with the mosquitoes as well. He did that for his entire life. So it must have been something like 40, 50 years. So he would move from kuti to kuti in order to avoid attachment as well. So one of the difficulties inside of monastic life, whether it's Buddhist or Christian or any other religion, is that monasticism, or ironically, tends to attract wealth, attention, and power. So it's often the case that we monastics just get caught up in that. So it's always a mixed picture inside monastic history, but it's very, very easy to be a young and idealistic monk and then just accidentally get caught up in the currents of the world, and then to see one's practice decline over time. So Gnanadippa Bhante clearly saw that pattern, and he did everything that he could to avoid it by moving from kuti to kuti year after year. He was also a dry vipassana practitioner. So it seemed like his samadhi practice wasn't very strong, but what he really emphasized was breaking through using right view to enlightenment.
And what were some gems that you remember he sort of gave you in terms of those final teachings that have stuck with you since?
Well, the greatest gem was actually how honest he was about his views and also about his own progress. So he was very, very willing to admit his defilements. He was willing to admit that he had difficulty socializing with people. He had difficulty forgiving people. But interestingly enough, you could also have really good Dhamma discussions with him, like really open and honest Dhamma discussions with him. You could actually disagree with him about views and then back up the reasons why you disagree with those views, and he would really, really listen. He wouldn't necessarily agree with you, but you could actually have a really good, robust conversation with him.
And he would, am I right in remembering that he memorized huge portions of the Tripitaka just as he wandered? Was that part of his practice as well, or how did he work with the suttas?
Well, he was quite a scholar, actually. So really great at Pali. Had a practice of chanting regularly. It seemed to have dropped off later in his life due to health problems, but he had a notebook and he would write down his favorite quotes, and he would go through in cycle those quotes and memorize them through chanting and recitation. He also seemed to have a capacity to learn languages. He had good similes, and not necessarily through talking to people, but just a linguistic mind, a really good scholarly and academic mind. People would often make comparisons between Gnanadippa Bhante and Mahakassapa, but Gnanadippa Bhante would never accept those comparisons. He'd always considered himself more in line with Sariputta, Thero, and that's actually Sariputta was a wandering monk. Inside the Suttas and Thero stories, we find that Sariputta is often wandering around and people can't find him, and he's often plunging into the forest. And then he's also an expert in wisdom and not the foremost in samatha and samadhi practices. So Gnanadippa Bhante made a really big part of his practice studying, just sitting down, reading books, understanding Pali as the original language in which the Buddha imparted his words, so that he could get as close as possible to what the historical Buddha was trying to tell us.
Thank you so much, Bhante. This is genuinely kind of a pretty precious glimpse into someone I think a lot of us have heard about. And I wondered if you would be able to speak to just his final, as much as you feel is appropriate, just how did you see him approach death and kind of the end of this life?
Unfortunately, I didn't get to see his final moments before he died. So he was in the monastery where we were all locked down during the first COVID lockdown from, I think, March 2020 to something like October of 2020, something like that. No, it must have been before. Yeah, so he left before that, actually, because before the rain retreat of that year, he was moved from Tanjung Tanna to Colombo as his health declined, and he was moved to Colombo to another monastery near Anuradhapura, the ancient capital, really, really ancient capital of county, the first capital of county. And that's where he died. So I didn't get to see him during the very last periods. But we already knew that he was dying when he was at Tanna, when we were looking after him there. And again, one of the greatest qualities that Nandita Bhante had was his humility. So he said to us that he spent his entire life trying to be as independent as possible, to be not a burden on the Sangha or onto the lay community, and to retain his own independence. And now that he was old and sick, he realized how much he needed the Sangha and that he needed to change his ways and embrace all the love and all the respect that the junior monks were really wanting to give to him. I find that very, very.
That's really beautiful. And would you, I think we have people's questions coming into the chat, but before we go to them, there was one more theme that we spoke about before beginning the live stream, which was how the COVID pandemic and just the situation of the world in general right now made you feel that people needed to, or that you needed to speak more directly about some of the teachings around rebirth and death. And I wondered if you could talk about that decision and why and what it means.
Yeah. So as a wandering monk, I meet many, many different kinds of monk, and especially in Sri Lanka, because Sri Lankan Buddhism is not standardized. There's all sorts of rogue and rebel monks in Sri Lanka, especially as samaneras, novice monks. Essentially, the way things work in Sri Lanka is that you can ordain as a novice monk and then wander around, or live in kutis, or wander around as a sadhu, as a shramana, as an ascetic that's not necessarily fully part of the Sangha and going by your own ideas. So you meet all sorts with all sorts of approaches to the Dhamma or even non-Dhamma. And it's given me this opportunity, that together with the wandering through Australia, to analyze what people are doing with their minds and with their bodies when they're practicing the Dhamma and what the results they're getting from that. And what I've discovered after close to 15 years of looking very, very carefully at what the effects of meditation are, I've discovered that actually there's a big foundation that we're all missing. So some people like to do vipassana practices, some people like to do samatha practices, some people like to do a combination of both. It looks like there's some people gathering at this library at the monastery that I'm currently residing, and they're looking for a Dhamma talk. So I'm just going to have to move my location.
That's fine.
Yeah.
It's in keeping with your role as a wandering monk. Please.
That's right. Got to be flexible.
And please feel free to type questions into the chat, everyone. We'll have a little bit of time for it. And Bhante Jinasiri will be joining us on Zoom after this as well, so people can log on to that for more discussion as well.
Okay, so it's essentially like this. Why do we want to meditate? Okay, for most people, they get into meditation because we're stressed out. We're seriously stressed out about everything. And we want to have stress reduction. And meditation is actually marketed in that way directly. Unfortunately, it seems that unless certain foundations are put into our practice of meditation, it doesn't have the sorts of effects, profound, long-lasting effects that it can have. Now, one of the foundations is right view, but right view at the lower level. There's two types of right view. The one that we know about is that we should be thinking in terms of how everything is impermanent, suffering, and not self. But another type of right view, the first type of right view that needs to precede that second type, is to actually believe in karma and rebirth. Now, it makes complete sense because actually the main cause, if you'll allow me just to get into really, really deep philosophical issues right off the bat, the main cause for our stress is not the fact that we can't meditate. The main cause for our stress and for the insanity of the modern world is the fact that we don't have a decent story about what's going to happen to us after we die. So imagine if you had no story about how you're going to deal with the fact that you need to grow up from childhood, go out into the world, get a job, and look after yourself. Nobody taught you anything about that. But you know that eventually you have to leave your parents' house. Don't you think that would stress you out every day? So everybody knows death is coming, but nobody will talk about it, right? If you don't talk about it and you don't have any sort of decent explanation about what's happening so that you can prepare for that fact, don't you think that's going to stress you out? And if you're really stressed out, then it's going to be very, very difficult actually to get deep into meditation. The Buddha actually teach that you meditate to get rid of the stress, right? What you do at the initial stage is you get rid of the stress with right view, and that opens the door to deep and long-term profound meditation.
And Bhante, what would you say to someone who might recognize this is a stressor for them, not knowing what happens after death, but also saying that's not reason in itself to adopt a view they're unsure is true? How would you speak to sort of the skeptical modern materialist around adopting this level of right view?
Sure. Then what I recommend is to really, really understand what science is all about. So science is not about trying to find absolute answers. Science is all about trying to come up with the very best story that you have that resolves the evidence that you happen to have right now. Yeah, and a scientist is always willing to change their view if they get new evidence. And the story that you have right now doesn't resolve the new evidence that you have. Or even if you don't get new evidence, if somebody else comes up with a better story that resolves the evidence that you have right now better, then you're willing to take up a new story. So that's what scientific consensus is really about. It's about getting together with other people so that you can come up with better stories and come up with better evidence. It's not about coming to absolute truths. Yeah, and then clinging around those absolute truths, because that would actually prevent you from coming up with better stories and coming up with better evidence. It would actually just make you stubborn, dogmatic, and fundamentalist. So one also has to realize that science is not about studying material things. It's studying about anything that's relevant for us to solve our problems. Science is not a domain of study. Science is a method of study. So you can use the scientific technique, which is essentially looking to gather evidence. It's empiricism, and then looking to think rationally about the evidence, and then engage with community in order to put those two things together so that you can cover your own mistakes. Now, you can do that with material things in the way that billiard balls knock against each other on a billiard table, but you can also do that with the way that we use our mind. And you can also do that with very, very difficult questions like what happens after death. You can do things like interview children who can remember past lives, or at least claim that they can remember past lives, and then try to work out whether or not what they're reporting is true. So just say they remember, or they say that they remember that there used to be a person who lived in a town 400 kilometers away, and their name was this and this, and their parents had this or that job, and they died in this and that way. Then you can go to that and then check the records to see whether or not any of these things actually happened. And then what you want to do is check if there's what other methods the child could have known this sort of information if you find that it's true. Yeah. What you want to do is be a scientist. You want to ask, okay, is there any other story than rebirth and remembrance of rebirth that could explain this evidence that I'm receiving right now? And then whatever stories that you generate, like he's got psychic powers, or he's heard it from somebody from that town who visited 3 years ago. Yeah, you need to compare it with the story of rebirth and see which one is more plausible given the totality of the evidence. So that's what you want to do. Fortunately for you, people have already done it. If you want to check this sort of stuff out, go onto the internet and check out the work of Professor Ian Stevenson and his students, Jim Tucker, and I think there's another one as well.
Thank you, Venerable Jinasiri. So leaning away from a laissez-faire agnosticism, acknowledging the importance of the problem and actually looking into what's there with an eye to how this is not an insignificant issue in terms of why we get so stressed out.
Well, precisely. The thing is, it's not an issue that you can just be agnostic about, right? It's not an issue that you can say, I don't know, I don't care, and it doesn't matter. Like, you can't be agnostic about the fact that you need to leave your parents' home eventually and that you need some skills to prepare you for the day. You need to have some story. And the fact is, everybody believes in something. Like, to even say that you believe that nothing happens after death is a belief. It's a story. Yeah, and if you invest in that story, even subconsciously, it affects the way that you live. Now, one of the most significant things that if your story is that there's nothing after death, then that's actually the ticket to sociopathy. Because essentially what you're saying is that you don't really believe in long-term consequences. Because you're going to die, and everyone else is going to die. So why not just have fun right now? Why not be a drug dealer? Oh, sure, other people are going to get hurt, but they're going to die anyway. So does it really matter? And I might as well have fun because I'm going to die anyway, right? So if somebody's going to have fun, why not? Why shouldn't it be me?
Thank you, Bhante. And I think we will post some of the links to Ian Stevenson's work. We actually had a really fascinating interview with Marjorie Woolacott, one of the researchers associated with Jim Tucker and others to some extent as well. And we'll have that link in the description also. And I wanted to take now, we have about 6 minutes left, and just to bring up some questions that have come up on the chat. So if people want to type in more, we'll see how many we can get to before we jump onto Zoom. So the first is, Malika, just wondering if you're living in Lagala with Venerable Gutta Sila.
No. I have visited Gutta Sila Bhante a few times and visited him also when he visits Kandy from time to time, but I've never actually lived in Lagala myself. When I'm living in the forest, I'm either at Tanjung Tanna or in a small private patch of forest about 50 kilometers away from Tanjung Tanna near a town called Bhikkhu. It's a tourist town.
Great. Rick asks, can you share a story of what you learned from facing hardship and pain?
Yeah, so basically it's not about being a tough guy. It's about being a resilient guy. And the key to resilience is learning how to love. It's learning how to forgive. All the things that get triggered off by the pain. Yeah, and so the more you can forgive, the more your energy flows while you're in pain. And that leads to healing and growth. So what you want to do is deliberately put yourself into manageable, painful situations. And how manageable things are depends on your skill level. It's no different to being an athlete. All right. So if you're an athlete and you're just a stupid tough guy,
putting yourself into difficult situations because you like pain and you like showing off how tough you are, then you just get hard, right? And then hard people break. You can manage it when you're young, but that's why so many athletes are like old men in terms of their knees by the time they're 35. What you want to do is know how to be a resilient guy so that you can keep up simplicity through your life, contentment, simplicity, frugality, sustainability through your life, all the way into the old age and age gracefully.
That's great. We have one from Landon. What would you advise someone who is sometimes scared of a lower rebirth?
Yeah, choose to live a good life. I mean, the Buddha taught that even if you're on your deathbed, if you can see that the way that you lived your life previously was really bad and you're fully committed to changing, that you see the danger that you're in, and that from now on, I'm going to make every effort that I can to stop killing, stealing, committing sexual misconduct, lying, drinking drugs, being stingy. But instead, I'm going to keep those precepts and live a life of love and generosity instead. And you really mean it. That's enough to save you from lower rebirth. But of course, really meaning it means once you've made that commitment, you've actually got to make the effort to change. But it doesn't matter if you make mistakes, right? What matters is that the view is real and you're authentically trying. So that's what confession is all about. One of the big things that you got to do, as we monks do, is you've got to find trustworthy people in your life that you can go to and just share the fact that you're not a perfect person. You've made mistakes, and then recommit over and over and over again with the people that you trust that you're going to be a better person from now on.
Kristen asks, how do we work with letting go of our fixed views and opinions, whether recognized or unrecognized, however subtle?
Yeah, don't ignore cognitive dissonance, right? So this is the way that you recognize your prejudice and you recognize your delusions. It's not impossible. People often think like, okay, it's easy for me to recognize my anger and it's easy for me to recognize my my lust and my greed, but delusion is a thing that stops us from seeing things. So how can you say delusion? Well, no, actually there is a really simple, direct way that you can do it, but it's still like everything else. What you have to do is notice when there's cognitive dissonance inside of you, and you do that by becoming very, very sensitive to your body. So you got to get whole body awareness. And what you'll find is whenever what you believe doesn't match up with reality, something will feel wrong inside your body. There'll be like, kind of feeling inside of your body somewhere. And you want to get really, really good at not ignoring that. You got to explore it. Whenever the cognitive dissonance comes up, you must not ignore it. Because it's stressful having cognitive dissonance, and you'll spend the rest of your life basically trying to distract yourself. That's what modern society is. A billion different ways to distract yourself from the fact that we're not facing up to reality. And we're producing lots of stress just from the cognitive dissonance itself, and then even more stress by the deluded ways that we live our lives that are completely unsustainable and leading to lots and lots of long-term and short-term suffering.
And Bhante, we have one final question, which I think is especially a good one to end on since we're out of time. But any words on Visakha Puja? I don't know if it's exactly aligning with your day over there, but it's Vesak over here. So what is Visakha Puja, and any words for us on it, if you would?
So Visakha Puja is the day where the Buddha got fully enlightened, and also the day where he attained his parinibbana, his death, where he made a complete ending of suffering. So when he got fully enlightened, he got rid of all of his mental suffering. And when he died as a fully enlightened being, all of his physical suffering disappeared as well. So these are days of great celebration for the Buddhist world. They're the days where we really bring our minds to the fact that the ending of suffering for us and everybody who chooses to walk the path is possible. So that's really, really important as an ordinary person to think about, use today, what's happening right here and now, to think about the past, that is the Buddha's life and the Buddha's teaching, and to think about your future and the future of your loved ones based upon the really, really hopeful vision that the Buddhist teachings gives to you. That's what Zaka is really all about.
It was so great to have you on, honestly. I can't believe it's taken us this long to actually meet each other. But then again, you haven't been on the internet for about 14 years, so it makes sense. I'm glad you're back on. And we've had a lot of...
I've been sort of on the internet on and off, but I haven't, like people have been approaching me, and every once in a while I do an interview. But from here on, I'm actually properly engaged with what real people do these days.
We'd love to have you on again. A lot of comments in the chat of just this being so helpful, and really wishing you back on the channel. So thank you for all the wisdom. And if people want, we're going to jump onto Zoom now, as we usually do, the post live stream Zoom. I'm putting the link in the chat, and Venerable Jinasiri will actually be there as well. So if you want to continue this discussion, then just click on that link. If you can't see the link for whatever reason, go to clearmountainmonastery.org, and halfway down the page, you'll see the listing for the Wednesday evening event, and the link to the Zoom is there. So Bhante, it's really a pleasure, and so grateful for meeting someone who's lived this monastic life with such integrity and real devotion to how the Buddha spoke of wandering and the lessons kind of gleaned from that life. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for having me. And I'll see everybody in about 5 minutes' time if you want to head on and ask some more questions.
Great. Okay.
Okay, thanks.
See everyone there. Bye. Bye, Bhante.